And good evening, everybody. I apologize. Our Facebook stream has not gone live at the moment, but if you're catching us live on YouTube as well as on the Den of Lore Facebook page, I have a very, very special guest with me this evening, Dr. John W. Hops. Close enough. I'm being scolded again for mispronouncing the name. Hops.
Say good looks or
Good looks
book.
or books. Hops. Who between July 1st and December 31st, 2017, will be a visiting professor and Greenleaf Distinguished Chair of Latin American Studies at Tulane University in New Orleans, with an appointment through the Roger Thane Stone Center of Latin American Studies in the Middle American Research Institute. His principal training is in archaeology, and interests include pre-Columbian cultures of Mesoamerica, the Isthmo-Colombian area and the Pan-Caribbean area, northern South America, and the Central Andes. He has been focusing on native cultures of Costa Rica for most of his career and has been developing an archaeological field project at Nuevo Corinto, an ancient village in the Caribbean lowlands of Costa Rica, in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Costa Rica. And his current research interests include interpretations of pre-Columbian art and iconography, shamanism, in quotation marks, and popular perceptions of archaeology as manifest in pseudoarchaeology, pseudoscience, and mythology in contemporary culture. Dr. Hoops, welcome to the Den of Lore. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. And the first time you've been on the show, and I know that you're don't generally do podcasts very often, so I have to say it is a pleasure and an honor of somebody of your distinction to take the time out of your day to be on this little old program.
Well, you're very welcome, Chris. It's an honor to be asked, and I'm happy to be here and to answer any questions that you have.
Now, the most important thing I have to say is, and I know that you are on your phone, so if you do need to place the phone down in any way, shape, or form, we're a relatively relaxed podcast here. So if you need to rest the arms or rest the hands, you let me know, and we'll readjust things as we go. Now, you and I had connected through a mutual friend of ours, Bernie, whom I know is probably going to be watching the show tonight, because he asked me, so when's the interview? I'm like, tonight. He's like, oh. And you've had a lot of interesting conversations with him, and I know that one of the things that I have been interested in seeing is recently your discussions with Graham Hancock on his new book, America Before, because it deals a lot with native cultures in South America, North America, Central America, and I haven't read the book myself. So Graham, if you're don't hit me on this. I got a 2-year-old at home, work full time. I don't have time to sleep half the time. So bear with me, please, Graham. And the discussions you guys have had have been not necessarily as heated as they can get academically. And I said, okay, well, I got to talk to this guy because I know Graham. I'm not going to say fairly well, but I know Graham well enough to know that he takes his work very seriously, and to be able to get the other side of the coin is an opportunity most people don't necessarily get. So, to start things off, how did you get into archaeology? At least to the interest of archaeology, and especially dealing with ancient cultures in this side of the planet.
Well, I'm happy to answer that, Chris, and I will, but I did want to make a slight clarification. I have never had a discussion with Graham, either online or in person. My dialogue with him has been indirect, and I think the only times we've communicated on Twitter have been when I was sending him well wishes when he was in the hospital. But to answer your question, my interest in archaeology goes way back. When I was a kid, I was very fascinated with fantasy and science fiction. I was a very avid reader of all of that stuff. I was a bit of a bookworm. I was a bit of a nerd. But my path into archaeology really grew out of my interest in fantasy and science fiction, to be perfectly honest.
By fantasy science fiction, are we talking like Lord of the Rings?
Yes. I read The Hobbit when I was 10 years old, and I had read the Lord of the Rings trilogy probably about 6 times before I graduated from high school. So I was a big Tolkien fan way back in the day.
Y- No, I can understand that. I actually did a book report. I'd read it so many times. I did a book report from memory when I was in high school. So it's one of those.
You probably know who else is a big Tolkien fan, actually much bigger than me, Stephen Colbert.
Considering I think he actually had a cameo in the Hobbit movies. Did he not?
He may have, I don't know.
Because
He would have loved it, sure.
well, I know that he had most of the cast, and he actually had he was actually presented with a sword by one of the cast members on, I believe it may have been the Colbert Report a long time ago. So you started with science fiction fantasy. Obviously, if you're going this route, and I know kind of how this goes, at least from my position, uh, and the direction that it can go into, like, did you have an interest also in anything having to deal with kind of like the mysterious paranormal UFOs, ancient history Atlantis from when you were younger as well?
Yes, I absolutely did. In fact, I remember watching a television interview with Betty and Barney Hill about their abduction experience. I think it was when I was in junior high. Um, my high school years were 1972 through 76, and you probably know that the early 70s were a time period when a lot of that stuff was very popular. Um, I read Chariots of the Gods shortly after it came out. I saw the film version in theaters during its first in theater run. Um, but I was reading a lot of weird stuff. I mean, I think as is true with a lot of teenagers, I was drawn to odd things. And to be perfectly honest, it started, now that I think about it, um, with talk radio. When I was a kid in elementary school, there was a talk radio host named Alan Christian in Baltimore on one of the AM radio stations. And he had a late night show in which he talked about the paranormal, and he talked about ghosts and UFOs and all different kinds of things. And I remember staying up late and listening to that. I had a small transistor radio, and I would listen to that AM talk show when I was in the fifth and sixth grades. So it's going back to the late '60s. And I'm turning 61 in a couple of weeks, actually next week. And so I've sort of seen the whole arc from the late '60s stuff through the '70s and into where we are right now. So my perspective on this is pretty long term.
And obviously, if you're looking at interest around that time, you must have read Chariots of the Gods. Everyone's read Chariots of the Gods.
Well, I mentioned I did read it. I read it when I was in the ninth grade, I think it was. Yeah.
Well, are you sure you're 61? Because it was about that time my mom gave me her copy of it, and I had to read through it. She's like, here's your reading. She'd started me off in Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision before that. Um, what were your opinions on that book? I know that you had mentioned that you had seen the movie as well when that came out.
Chariots of the Gods, I thought it was very cool. It introduced me to a lot of things that I had not known about before. And like I said, I was a bookworm, so I sort of took clues from that. And I read Thor Heyerdahl's books on Easter Island, for example. I developed an interest in ancient Mayas, so I began looking for stuff on the Mayas. Um, and I also got interested in the Atlantis myth. So I read Ignatius Donnelly's book about Atlantis. I was reading Charles Berlitz's stuff on the Bermuda Triangle. Um, I was just into a lot of that stuff. Um, you're probably familiar with Charles Fort and sort of Fortean phenomena. Um, he
Yes.
was a Yeah. Well, anyway, I was very much into Fortean stuff and Fortean books and Stranger Than Science. I've forgotten who the author of that was, but collections of odd stories about weird things that happened. Cryptozoology, um, those types of things, and that's actually what kind of sparked my interest in archaeology early on. Um, in fact, it was a 10th grade English paper on this on Atlantis that I that I wrote in 1974. It was probably my first research paper ever in my career. Um, and I wanted to explore this issue of what the lost continent was and what the story was behind it. And then that sort of led me into the archaeology of the Mediterranean and some of the theories about how that how that story got started. So these things have been a part of my consciousness for, you know, forever, it seems. Over 50 years.
And if 50 years is a long time to be searching for Atlantis, and some people have been claiming to have been searching for it for pretty much their entire lives as it stands. Uh, how did you try and reconcile first off your the academics and like rational claim grounded side of archaeology with the mythos itself? Like, did you try and find a middle ground at any point?
Well, what I remember, and actually this was a very important part of my coming of age, is that I began to realize that the myths that were being presented were not completely honest, and that there was manipulation of the facts, and that the individuals who were speaking about these things were not completely trustworthy. And to give you a bit of a background to that, I also, this was the early 70s, I was into rock music. And two of my favorite things to listen to were Jesus Christ Superstar and the rock opera Tommy by The Who. And as you probably know, both of those have as themes um, the sort of debunking of a mythological superstar. In the rock opera Tommy, it's the deaf, dumb, and blind boy who is enlightened by his encounter with the pinball wizard, and then starts his camp where he's teaching other people to become enlightened, and it doesn't work out very well. Um, Jesus Christ Superstar is sort of a different take on the story of Jesus. It humanizes him a bit, but it also expresses some skepticism. And to be perfectly honest, I think my skepticism was cultivated in particular by those two rock operas, Tommy and Jesus Christ Superstar. But I also listened to a very irreverent comedy performance troupe that was called the Firesign Theater,
Hmm.
uh, and they also were, took a very humorous take, typically fueled by cannabis and others too, perhaps, uh, in looking at some of this weird stuff. And so I began to realize that there was another story to what was being said in terms of the hype, and I think that's how I cultivated a skeptical attitude towards that. Something else that I should mention, that was also part of my formation, is that I grew up in what was basically a single parent home. My parents had divorced when I was 5 years old, and my mother went through a difficult time health wise and also with the death of her father,
Hmm.
which she dealt with by becoming a Rosicrucian. She actually joined the ancient mystical order of Rosicrucius, which she was introduced to by a cousin. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Rosicrucians,
Yes, I'm very
but
familiar with the Rosicrucians.
well, then then you have a sense of it. But the home that I grew up in was filled with Rosicrucian literature, so I was seeing that stuff
Hmm.
at the same time. Um, it was I grew up in Baltimore, which was kind of an interesting place to be. People want to know what my neighborhood and my my environment looked like, and I say, well, go watch a John Waters film. That was my high school experience, although not exactly. But John Waters is kind of weird, um, but I love him. I think it's fantastic stuff. But some of your listeners may be familiar with Dr. Bob Hieronymus uh, of 21st Century Radio.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Bob was from Baltimore, and he had a commune called Savitria, where he had where there was a school that was called the Aquarian University of Maryland. And in the 1970s, they offered courses on astrology, on pyramid power, on crystal healing, on the occult and the esoteric stuff. And I was very much aware of that when I was in high school. I actually took a course in non-Euclidean geometry at the Aquarian University of Maryland, where people would hang out. There was also a place that was called the Aquarian Age
Hmm.
Bookstore. It was one of the classic occult bookstores of the 1970s. It was kind of a hippie hangout, But you could go there and you would be able to find books on crystal balls or tarot cards or the occult or those types of things. I was really fascinated with that stuff because it intersected with what I was reading. And to be perfectly honest, it was also kind of a bit of escapism as well.
Oh, and escapism tends to be one of the, at least from my experience, it seems to be a lot of the people will get into the paranormal or will get into the esoteric side of things or the esoteric side of philosophy to find an escape from something, whether it's bad relationship or bad boring work, or just from the world in general, just from the fact that we don't exactly live in a peaceful world, and not everyone's happy all the time. So it is sometimes nice to be able to have that blanket, as it were.
Right.
So,
I grew up in some difficult neighborhoods in Baltimore. The school that I went to, junior high, was turned into a police academy. The high school that I attended was closed down last year. If you've watched The Wire,
mhm.
um, that's another good way to get a sense of what my environment was like growing up. So, combination of John Waters and The Wire, that was very much the Baltimore I grew up in. And so I found this fantasy stuff, and especially archaeology of exotic, distant places, to be really fascinating um, imaginary getaway, or some of it was imaginary, some of it was not. Actually, I think one of the reasons I got interested in archaeology was because I realized that Middle Earth and the Tolkien world was an imaginary world, but in reading about the ancient past in archaeology, those places were real. You could go and visit them. You could go to a museum and see the artifacts. There were people who touched them and held them and studied them, and it was this connecting with a real tangible past that I just found amazing. I just found that wonderful. The idea that this fantastic imaginary world could actually be a real place was one of the things it really drew me into archaeology.
And did you, at any point when you were going through either your studies or looking back at the environment that you grew up in and the reading that you had done prior to that, at what point did you kind of at least realize to yourself that or at least had that idea in your head that, okay, hey, maybe this is actually just a myth, maybe there are things that are blown out of proportion? What was your kind of light bulb moment?
Well, I don't know if I can remember a light bulb moment, but it was in the context of writing that paper on Atlantis that I really had this realization because I had first learned about Atlantis through a pop song called Atlantis by Donovan. You're probably familiar with it. It sort of tells a little story of what happened to Atlantis, and it's the fact that it was the location of these travelers who went and spread information and knowledge around the world, um, and then sank beneath the waves. Anyway, that was my starting point. I then read Ignatius Donnelly, which was a book published in 1882, but nonetheless it covered a lot of ground. But then I began reading um, a book that had recently been published that was called Atlantis: The Truth Behind the Legend by a geologist named A.G. Gallinopoulos. And he was one of the first to come up with the hypothesis that the destruction of Atlantis was actually due to a real geological event, which was the eruption of the volcano in Thera in the Mediterranean, now known as Santorini, which had caused a massive tsunami that had, at least according to him, had a significant impact on the Minoan coast of Crete, or the Minoan culture on the coast of Crete. And he was providing a real, tangible, geologically based explanation for the origin of the Atlantis legend. Um, and to be perfectly honest, that resonates with what's being done now with Graham Hancock and the Younger Dryas impact theory and other types of things. It's also something that Ignatius Donnelly had explored, was the possibility that comets had caused the Great Flood and had destroyed Atlantis. But for me, it was this realization that you could actually go to these places and look at the geology and look at the archaeology and do kind of a scientific study of the actual evidence and see whether that made intuitive sense, see whether that fit.
Now, just to be able to go back right to the beginning, where again you did make that correction, and I do apologize. Graham was included in this Twitter thread. Graham had posted a this is on November 30th. He posted a post from his website, which was a response to several individuals, and I believe it was either Scientific America or Society for American Archeology. There was an article in a magazine. I've read Graham's response. I've read the individuals who wrote in that particular article, and actually a couple of them have been on this show. A couple of people that I do know. Uh,
Oh,
well, Jason Colavito, I've been following his work for quite some time.
right.
And I know that let's see who else was on there.
Jennifer Raff, Jeb Card,
Jeb well,
David.
Jeb's been on the show.
Oh, good.
He was on a couple of months ago, and we had a good discussion on that. And he had posted it, and I don't think Graham had actually responded to anything. So I do apologize if I jumped the gun on there. I was sent this post by Bernie, and he said, "You got to read this." And I saw your name, and I saw Jason's, and I saw let's see who else was in there. George Howard, who's a friend of mine, whom I've been following his work for quite some time. And I'm like, okay, well, I got to get to the bottom of this somehow. And I know that for some individuals it can get quite heated. Graham's stayed out of the whole fray at this point. He's already given his response to that. So I would like to be able to make that correction officially, and I do apologize if I had jumped the gun on that.
Well,
When
you had said that I had been in a discussion with Graham, and I would love to be in a discussion with Graham, but I've actually never had any. I've never met him, and I never had a conversation with him, nor even much of a Twitter exchange. Although we had a very brief exchange a few years ago when he was hospitalized. But what I should clarify for you, Chris, is that that particular what Graham responded to was a special section that I organized, and I invited the authors who you mentioned to contribute to it, including Carl Fegans, whose name hasn't been mentioned yet. But I organized that section. I was the editor for that section. I wrote an introduction to it, um, and it happened because I thought it was an important thing to do.
okay, and that's I'm gonna say that's kind of mind blowing. I've been doing this show for a number of years, but it's always whenever you get like a huge piece of information that it's like, how do you respond to that? And as somebody who's an academic, it's important for you to be able to present your case and to be able to bring people together to be able to present a case, and that's the whole idea of a debate. At least, I'm going to say debate, at least a discussion. A debate in academic terms can be a very uh, confrontational word. I know that much. But from a discussion standpoint, it's important to discuss all the facts and be able to say, here's my evidence and here's my point of view. Okay, well then refute the point of view and talk it out. So
Mhm.
it's something that between the alternative history side of things and the academic side of things, there has been no real discussion about it whatsoever. It's been conflict. It's been insert not to say that you have been, but there's been name calling from one side or another. Uh, it just seems like nobody take like some people don't take some people do not take academia seriously on the alternative side. Academia doesn't necessarily take the alternative history side because, again, let's face it, there are people out there whom do kind of spin some yarns and they're trying to sell crystals and snake oils and what have you. But there is no, um, there has not been a true, I'm going to say, effort that I've seen for a mutual understanding or at least a coming together of minds, because again there may be many good points that the academic side is making from either Graham's work or the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis or what have you, and there is a possibility that there are points that do need to be looked at from the alternative history side. But I know that unless there's actually discussion that is fostered and there's not some type of open ground that people can actually come together and talk about things, then nothing's ever going to get resolved.
Well,
Maybe
I agree. That's right.
so. If one of the big things from this this article and this discussion, especially dealing with archaeology from South America or from Mesoamerica or from Central America, to be able to make a hypothesis and say this is a hypothesis that, okay, was Atlantis based in Mesoamerica? Do we have, or in the middle of the Atlantic? Is there geological proof to that? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis can provide a certain framework to say, is this possible? Are there scientific methods to try and test and to try and pinpoint a date? Now, the Atlantis myth is based around that idea of 10,000 years before the time of Solon. That's in the Atlantis myth. If
that's an interpretation of it.
Well,
that interpretation, but yeah.
Okay, well, I would like to be able to hear your side from the different interpretation. That this is what is being claimed from a lot of alternative history researchers. What is the academic take on it?
Well, I would love to answer that question, but can I give you a little bit of background first?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Well, what I'd like to explain, and what your listeners probably will find especially interesting, is why I felt it was important to edit and publish this collection of articles in the first place. And here's how it evolved. As a specialist in the archaeology of Central America, with a long history of research in Costa Rica, one of the things that I've been interested in over the years is those giant stone spheres in Costa Rica. Are you familiar with those?
Yes, I am. They tried to smash them open to find gold and goodness knows what else.
That's right. And most people don't make this connection, but that giant sphere that rolls after Indiana Jones in the opening sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's one of those spheres. They're real objects. But a couple of years ago, I learned through my colleagues in Costa Rica that Graham was in Costa Rica, and he actually went to visit the sites with the big stone spheres, which in 2014 were identified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And when I saw that, and actually saw a photograph online of Graham Hancock talking to one of my former PhD students, an archaeologist named Francisco Corrales, I got in touch with Francisco and I said, "Do you know who this is?" And he said, "No, I don't have a clue." And I said, "Well, that's Graham Hancock." And he said, "Who's Graham Hancock?" I just met him. And because he sees tourists and visitors all the time. And so I gave him some background and explained who Graham was, and fingerprints of the gods, and other parts of Graham's work. But here's something that will be just mind-blowing to you and to many of your listeners. The more I began talking to colleagues in archaeology, the more I realized that very few professional archaeologists had a clue who Graham Hancock was. They had never heard his name, much less read any of his work. And I just kind of realized, wait a minute, here's somebody who's getting millions of views on podcasts with Joe Rogan, and my colleagues don't know who that is. They've never heard of him. And so I thought, well, wait a minute. If we're going to have these dialogues, then other archaeologists need a heads up as to what's going on. And when I learned about America before, that it was in preparation and when it was going to come out, I approached the editor of the Society for American Archaeology magazine. It's called the SAA Archaeological Record. And I said, look, this book is coming out. It focuses on North American prehistory, but actually the archaeology of the Americas. I said, there are going to be topics in here that will be of interest to professional archaeologists who work in the Americas. We really ought to plan on doing something to inform our colleagues about who this is, because there is such a vast gulf between academia and alternative history. And as you can probably get a sense of from talking with people on both sides in the community, we just don't talk to each other very much.
Uh-huh.
Another topic of interest of mine, which we can get into if you like, is the whole issue of psychotropics and psychedelics and hallucinogens that have been used by indigenous people in the ancient past. Well, I was talking to a colleague in my department today, and I said, well, do you know about The Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby? And I was saying this to actually Jennifer Raff, who is a specialist in ancient DNA and contributed to the SAA issue. And she said, no, I've never heard of that. Who is that? Well, anybody who's dealing with psychedelics and ayahuasca and that type of stuff will instantly know who Jeremy Narby was. But most of my anthropology colleagues don't have a clue. Um, it's kind of a quirky thing that in academia, so much of this non-academic stuff, which is very much a part of cyberculture, very much a part of counterculture, and very much a part of contemporary culture, has just gone over people's heads, or they don't even pay attention to it. So I thought, here's an opportunity to do that, which is why we put this section together. And actually, the articles were written for our colleagues in archaeology. They weren't really written for the general public. They were an attempt to try to bridge this gap, and they were not intended as an attack on Graham. I don't think that they are. They weren't intended as reviews of his book. I don't think they are. They were really intended to give our colleagues in archaeology a heads up about Graham Hancock's work, some background on it, and give them some information that they could use to talk to students or to talk to the general public, or essentially to stop being clueless about these other conversations that are going on.
And how has there been a mainstream, or even from the alternative history side, and I'm saying from besides Graham's response, what has been the response to it?
So far, I have heard mostly from the individuals who I know in the sort of debunking pseudoarchaeology circle. The individuals you talked about already: David Anderson, Deb Card, Ken Fader, Jason Colavito, and then others. I'm on Twitter, and people are welcome to follow my Twitter feed. It's at KU Hooks. That's at UHOOPES. You're welcome to follow me on Twitter and ask me questions. I'll be happy to answer them if I can. But I've seen virtually no response from the archaeology side, except for the usual suspects. On the other hand, on the alternative history side, as you probably know, Graham's blog post has a long list of responses. I don't know how many there are. And his Twitter post also has 80 or some responses to it. But as you know, Graham has a huge audience. I haven't checked to see what his Joe Rogan podcast about America Before is up to, but when I wrote the article, it was 2.5 million views. It's probably up well over that by now.
Mm-hmm.
So Graham has a footprint in the consciousness of at least a segment of the cyber community that's paying attention to it. But he has virtually no recognition in academia, which is very strange.
Which is also very interesting because, again, Graham will, and you also have to understand from I'm going to say his and his colleagues coming up party, if to use the colloquial term, in the early 90s, when personal hero of mine, John Anthony West, when he had brought forth the water erosion hypothesis for the Sphinx, Egyptology mercilessly attacked them, even though they did have academic backing from a large part of the geological community to say, well, this is so. There is.
Stop. He's not really a large part of the geological
community. Well, no. Well, he is a tenured professor, but they did have they did
voice, but I don't know that he represents the geological community.
No, and they did have backing from his colleagues, and many of his colleagues during that time. But fact is,
main thing that did it was The Mysterious Origins of Man, which was a documentary that was produced and aired on NBC and seen by millions. So West and Graham and others were able to get their voice out to a big viewer audience. Mm-hmm. That was mostly what was going on.
So at that point, there was a considerable amount of hostility that they had received because of that, whether it was either from just the fact that, as you had said, that they had a very large audience and certain individuals did not, Uh, but since then, there has been at least there has been very tenuous, either what I'm trying to be able to find the proper term here. I'm not going to say hostility, but more of a caution about academia because of the amount that they were attacked, which I can understand from a certain perspective. But if you're saying that at least right now in 2019 that you're a large part of the academic community is not necessarily aware of his work or aware of what is being said about him, it doesn't make sense why he would continue to be able to look down upon the academics when it's just as easy to be able to reach out and say, well, hey, is there something that can be talked about?
Well, I know that Graham does reach out because he quotes a number of archaeologists in his books, especially the most recent one. Yeah, I mean, he goes out and he finds archaeologists and talks with them. Um, and I don't think. I mean, what I remember about the mysterious origins of man, I think it aired in 1994, is it presented this chronology for the Sphinx and a whole host of other things. But the blowback was mostly at NBC. It was mostly at network television for taking something that had not been vetted by archaeologists or by historians, and was really one of the biggest flashes of pseudoarchaeology, alternative history, whatever you want to call it, on major network TV. And I don't know whether have you seen that program? I,
That
I
one,
remember I remember when it aired. Do you know who it was narrated by?
well, if I'm not mistaken, I remember Mysteries of the Sphinx, and that was actually narrated by Charlton Heston.
That's
So,
Carlton Hess, former. He later became president of the National Rifle
yeah,
Association.
no,
Now had played Moses in the
yes,
Ten Commandments and Ben Hur and those other types of things. So you had the voice of Moses and the National Rifle Association articulating what became kind of a standard of alternative history and pseudo archaeology, fringe archaeology, whatever you want to call it. But the problem is it's being called fringe, but because it was getting network attention, it really popped out into the mainstream. And I have a lot of debates with my colleagues about what is mainstream. Is mainstream what it is, what a very small number of us in academia are saying, or is mainstream what the general public believes? What the man on the street thinks? What defines the mainstream?
well, it's the difference between the marketplace or the ivory tower. The person who's and I'm not using this in a derogatory term, but if you have somebody, a wise man who spends all of his time in locked away somewhere doing studies, does he know as much about the world in the right here and now as somebody who's out on the streets then and there? That's kind of the debate. Is it one thing to be able to know history, or is it or to be able to say, I know about this because I've read it in a book, or I know about this because I've actually experienced it, I've been there, I've seen it? And that's the age old debate. So,
Well, but if you own a high-end car like a Jaguar,
mhm.
like a Tesla, and you're having problems with it, are you going to go to your dentist and ask him to work on it? Or are you going to find a certified Jaguar or Tesla mechanic who has spent decades studying with those companies about how to fix those cars and knows how to do it correctly?
Well, first of all, I would never buy a Jaguar because they'll fall apart. And Tesla,
Well,
most people
that's
are
true.
learning. Well, Teslas, yeah, they will fall apart, but most people are learning how to hack and repair their own Teslas because after the warranty is done. But again, we're splitting hairs here. I understand what you're saying, but uh, and actually, I've got Bernie saying that he's like, yeah, that's actually a really good point about the mainstream. But if you also look at the mainstream compared to mainstream media, you have individuals whom, to my generation and younger, uh, if it's not on YouTube and it doesn't have a million views, people will know more about that than what happened on Survivor that week. Television is much less mainstream than media such as this, independent media, or
Right.
you know,
But that's been a shift in the past 10 years or so or
Mhm.
whatever. We've moved away from network television to then cable television with however many channels to now the internet and the YouTube with thousands and thousands of channels. So, it's hard to say what's mainstream anymore. But, I grew up with network TV. There were three stations: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then you had a few UHF channels and things like that. But what defined the mainstream was that everybody only had a narrow number of choices every night on television. Now you've got thousands of choices, um, and you also have communities like your community of listeners who will identify a set number of authors and a set number of ideas, and they're comfortable with those, and probably have trouble keeping up on top of those. But do they ever venture out and look at something that's not in the alternative history genre? Do they go to the libraries and find academic stuff? Well, here's an answer. And this is one of my own pet beefs, one of my own complaints, is that public libraries do not have the funds to collect academic books. Academic books are expensive as hell. They're not published in large quantities. Uh, and public libraries can't buy them, but public libraries can buy trade books. And most public libraries will have at least one, if not more, books by Graham Hancock. But they will not have books, typically, from the University of Pennsylvania Press or the University of Chicago Press or other academic presses. Why? Because they sell for 70, 80, $120. Academic books are expensive, which is why they're only acquired by university libraries. And unless you are, unless you go to the university or are a student or a faculty member, you're not going to have access to that stuff. The same goes for a lot of peer-reviewed literature. Until recently, most of that peer-reviewed stuff was locked behind paywalls.
Now
Um,
there's, yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, no, well, at this point now there's actually a torrent website that will it's basically like the Napster of peer-reviewed papers. Because and a lot of people say, like, well, if it's being used with academic money and a lot of that's being funded by the government, it should be free for everyone to see. If the people are funding it, the people should be able to see it and read it. So that's kind of the view behind that.
Well,
Um,
I completely agree with you, and I'm forgetting his name. Maybe you remember it, but sadly, there was a hacker maybe 10, 15 years ago who downloaded thousands and thousands of articles from JSTOR, and he was sued. He ultimately wound up taking his own life, but he was trying to take that information and make it public. The question is monetization models. Okay, the question is, how are you going to pay for the research? How are you going to pay for publications? Um, I can promise you, if you want to go on Amazon and find a used copy of Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, you can probably pay $3 or $4, maybe $5 for a
mhm.
used copy of that. If you go on Amazon and try to buy an academic book, they actually increase in cost over time because they're typically published in limited runs of maybe 1,000 copies when you're lucky, and they're collected by academics and by libraries. So they will cost hundreds of dollars. In fact, I was just looking at this book talking about Jeb Card. Um, this is Jeb
Spooky
Card's new
Arrow,
book,
yeah.
Archeology. This is a hardcover. I paid $75 for this. If you go on Amazon or the used book market and you try to buy a hard copy of this book, which just came out last year,
Hmm.
it's selling for hundreds of dollars already because the hard copy is sold out and out of print. It's in print with a paperback. You can buy the new paperback new, and I really encourage people to. I'll put in a plug for Jeb's book. It's an excellent book, Spooky Archaeology, Myth
Available on
and Science.
Amazon.com.
Uh, but
There we go, John. we're oh jeez. Oh, Jeb will be happy about that. It's a good book. You can go check it out, ladies and gents. Um,
but my point is, his book was published by an academic press. It's not something that you're going to find in the bookstores.
mm,
It's not something you're even going to find in a public library unless you happen to have some really astute, hip, uh, paying attention librarians who are going to go out and look for it, or people who are going to request that their local public library buy it. But in general, really good quality books on archaeology or pseudoarchaeology or anything in academia, you cannot get them at your local public library. You have to go to a university to find them.
Lee is chiming in on chat and saying that it was Aaron Schwartz was the individual who was sued and took his own life. Uh,
That's
and
right.
and Audrey, who's a longtime listener of the show, I think makes a pretty good point, and that's saying that using Charlton Heston as a voice for the documentary was adding a familiar, likable voice that would draw in viewers, which is basically Hollywood. And that, the concern then was viewers,
Well, it was
money, and
also
not
Moses'
historicity.
story. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Which the concern then was viewers, money, and not historicity. Which I might be a typo, but it sounds like a pretty good word to me. So Audrey, thank you for that one. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's another point of view. To bring things a little more on the contemporary side, I've listened to Graham's lecture for Before America. I've watched the Joe Rogan episode once, I think, like when it was first released, and I'd followed the like I'd read um, Fingerprints of the Gods. I've read Magicians of the Gods. That was actually on audiobook, and I haven't actually had a chance to be able to pick up America before. So what are kind of the
Right.
main
I actually put this over here because I was anticipating that you might want to see it. You see what this is right here? Here we go.
sign of the seal? Well, at least
That's a stack of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 9grams books. I've got them all sitting right here. People think that academics don't look at these. I try to.
well, I'm sure he'll be appreciative for the sales of his editions, especially since they're the hard copy. Now, for the recent book, um, and knowing that my reading had stopped at around Magicians of the Gods, and trying to reconcile the possibility of some type of prehistorical seafaring peoples that had a shared history in western as well as eastern parts of South America, and even into Mexico. What is basically your take? I'm trying to be able to find a good entry point into this. What's your take on this? Oh, sorry, I can't. I think you might be covering the microphone.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you
That's
hear me
okay.
now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. I had said I would give an answer on Atlantis, but I hadn't done that yet.
Okay.
Um, but the quick answer is that the 9,000 years in Plato may be wrong by a factor of 10. In fact, that's one of the theories of Gallinopoulos, who wrote this about 50 years ago, is that in the account by Plato, let's go back into who tells it. Plato is the one who writes the story. He hears it from Critias, who heard the story as a 10-year-old boy from his 90-year-old grandfather, who happened to hear it from Solon, who was told it by the priests of ancient Egypt. So that just in Plato's account, that's 5 different transmissions of that story. Do you think it's possible that during those 5 transmissions of the story, somewhere in there, someone might have added a zero? So 900 years became 9,000 years. Well, if it's only 900 years, that puts you back into the time of Minoan civilization. There's also a lot that was happening in Egypt at the time. There were some things that were happening in Mycenae in Greece. Um, 900 years before Solon is a lot more reasonable than 9,000 years before Solon. But people rarely seem to consider the possibility that there was a mistake made along the way, and that somehow 900 got to be 9,000. Now, most classicists, most specialists in Plato, feel that the whole story was made up, and that 9,000 is just like saying a long, long time ago in a
Galaxy
galaxy
far,
far,
far
far
away.
away, um, and don't put a whole lot of stock in that 9,000 figure. But for those people who want to believe in Atlantis and this Atlantis story, it's one that gets repeated over and over and over again. And so my first bit of skepticism is, look at these facts and consider some alternative explanations for those facts, rather than building a house of cards model on top of what might be a fallacious assumption that the number 9,000 is correct.
Okay, let's assume that it isn't correct. Let's play a thought experiment here, ladies and gentlemen. We're gonna we're gonna go down the rabbit hole of rationality here. Let's say it is not correct, and people are interpreting it, and it was said within within the myth that it's X number of years before Solon, and there is evidence for something that happened that could account for the story. Does that mean that there isn't also a possibility that something in that age could have happened? Like, is it possible for both to be wrong and for both to be right?
Well, what Gallinopoulos suggested 50 years ago, and I should mention Gallinopoulos's theory is not accepted by classical archaeologists. They feel that he was a geologist, sort of like the ones with the Younger Dryas comet hypothesis, who was sort of using a geological phenomenon to try to explain ancient myth. And they typically don't find that valid. But I like to point out that Heinrich Schliemann was able to demonstrate that there is a reasonable possibility that the tale of Hisarlik in Western Turkey corresponds to the Troy of Homer, that Homer's stories about Agamemnon and other types of things might be related to the Mycenaeans, and that the story of Theseus and the Minotaur may have some links to Knossos in Crete. There may be some historical context for these other myths and legends. The same goes for the Bible. And I will tell you, I mean, some people may disagree with me. The Bible is not the best source on history, depending on what you're looking at. There are parts of it that were probably derived from Sumerian mythology. There are other parts that were probably derived from people looking at the archaeological landscape of the Holy Land and putting their own interpretations on the ruined cities that they encountered. But there's a lot of debate going on as to how much in these myths, and I would include the Bible and Homer and Plato and all of that in there, how much of that can be tested archaeologically, and seems to resonate with the hard scientific facts that we can recover from geology, archaeology, history, and other types of things. I tend to feel that there's probably a core of reality in most mythology, but I also think it's a big, big mistake to take any of these myths literally.
Now, I'm trying not to cough too much right now. The from and I can see from your point of view that there seems to be a lot of, well, if X happened, then that must mean Y happened, which must mean Z, and the idea of trying to string together and make things fit. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, I'm going to try and bring that just singularly by itself. There is a lot of scientific evidence that is a possibility. There's
a lot of scientific evidence against it.
Well, that as well. Again, but I've read the papers on both sides, and it's like, okay, well, to me it seems credible that it's a possibility. Now, linking that particular,
I would say I agree with that. It is credible that it's a possibility.
So, hey, we're making progress, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the idea that this happened, and this is an event, to be able to say, okay, well, this must mean that what has been said in the Plato myth, that Atlantis was gone in an hour and a day, or whatever the amount of time was that it sank due to this massive deluge, and it sank beneath the waves. It is somewhat, and I can admit that it is somewhat of a logical fallacy to be able to immediately jump on that is the explanation and say, okay, because there is evidence for this, that this must be true. Because nobody who understands logic can make that jump in good faith. That I can admit. The fact that the dates line up supposedly between the potentially wrong date in the myth to when this impact is supposed to have happened does seem quite interesting. At least I could say that much.
But they don't really line up if you look at the details.
This is true. There are potentially multiple floods that may have happened due to pulse water A and B in North America that could have caused a lot of the flooding in, let's say, the Scablands or into the Atlantic Ocean, which could have caused a whole host of issues. Now, those happened at different periods of time. It may have been around the same date. It could have been within several hundred years of each other. The fact is, I don't think we've actually ever seen it lined up. We've heard 13,000 or 10,500 BC. Okay, that's a given time. Even the dates within the geological record don't necessarily line up 100% with that, and that you could give or take a couple centuries one way or another. Uh, some
Well,
people
sometimes it's give or take 1,000 years or two.
true. So, what would be your main within your realm of study, not necessarily within pseudoarchaeology, but comparing what Hancock has discussed with either fingerprints of the or magicians of the gods, and with America before. How are some of the differences, at least that you're seeing from what is being reported on? Because again, Graham is not an archaeologist; he's a reporter, he's a writer. He will chronicle stories and he'll pose things and from his perspectives. And yes, there may be a certain amount of um, hypothesizing going on, but from your perspective, what are kind of the main differences?
Um, well, first of all, one of the things I think it's important to point out, the idea of a comet causing the Great Flood and the sinking of Atlantis is not new. It was actually proposed in 1883 by Ignatius Donnelly, the same person who in 1882 wrote a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And he proposed in a book that was called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, that the Great Flood of Noah and the sinking of Atlantis were the same event and that they had been caused by a comet. So this idea has been kicking around for 140 years. It's been around for a long time. Um, and so there's that. It's not that it hasn't been considered. It's not that it hasn't been tested. But there's a lot that's wrapped up in it. In fact, a lot of the individuals who have been interested in the Younger Dryas comet hypothesis have been interested in proving that the Great Flood happened, the flood of Noah. And they're coming at it from a religious perspective. They're coming at it from a perspective of sort of Christian beliefs that the events of Genesis are true. And they're also putting it within a bigger model. I don't know. You're probably familiar with this book.
Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes. Yes.
Yeah. That's one of the places where the hypothesis first comes into kind of contemporary consideration. They're reviving what was kicking around for a long time. But for me, the first issue is a comet impact is a pretty specific astronomical event. If you're going to play with a few hundred years here and there, or a couple of thousand years here or there, then that's not corresponding to reality. If there was a comet impact, it happened all of a sudden at once. It didn't happen over hundreds of years or thousands of years. Although I think some people have suggested there were fragments of comets that were arriving every few years and that may have been spread out over a long period of time.
Which is possible.
Which is certainly possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. But some of it seems like moving the goalposts. No, just something to consider. There also are claims that have been made that just don't stand up to careful scrutiny. For example, claiming that there is a signature of a major meteorite impact under the Greenland ice cap. Well, it's possible, but it hasn't been proven. The data are just not sufficient to be able to say whether that crater is there or not. That's testable. Better data will probably show whether it's true or not. But you have to go with the data. You have to be able to say we don't know. And a lot of times the problem I see with alternative history and pseudoarchaeology is that it's jumping the gun in terms of interpretations. Rather than saying, we don't know, we really need more information, it instead leads readers into believing that speculation is much more grounded in fact than it actually is. And a lot of times it's driven by a desire, sometimes a very deeply felt and very meaningful desire to believe in things, to believe in the flood of Genesis, or to believe in the story of a utopian society, um, whether it was on Atlantis or anywhere else that existed over 10,000 years ago, or to believe in the face on Mars and the idea that there had been a civilization on another planet, or to believe that the Maya actually prophesied that the world would come to an end in December 2012. There are a lot of things that people want to believe, um, but they don't necessarily have a basis in the facts, that don't have a basis in reality. And I really think there's good reason to be skeptical about so many of these things because many of them just turned out not to be true. The face on Mars, for example, that was an interesting possibility that someone had made this huge monument on Mars. But when you begin getting better probes and better photography and better resolution in the imagery, it became pretty clear that that big thing in the Cydonia region was not a massive Egyptian face. It was just a weird shaped rock.
Richard C. Hoagland, he's been on the show too.
Right.
So nice guy. At the end of the day, it's a matter of, okay, well, I can't physically go to Mars to go check this stuff out. I don't necessarily believe in the NASA hiding stuff aspect of it. The grand cover up. Is it possible? Like, well, it's also possible I could wake up and I've got a gold toilet in my washroom tomorrow morning that I can, I could sell for a Porsche or something. But
Right.
it's not necessarily very likely. The idea to believe based on wanting to believe in something, and this is a rule that I've gotten from a fantasy writer that you may know, Terry Goodkind.
No, I don't.
Read. I would read it. It's fantastic work. A little more in like the Game of Thrones high fantasy style, but still very
Right.
good. And the idea that people can believe a lie because they want it to be true, or they are afraid that it is true, because people's heads are filled with a bunch of information that they think that they know, and they think that they know that they can tell a lie from not a lie, and because of that, they're easier to fool. And
Right.
the idea of, well, things are possible, but skepticism is healthy to a certain extent to be able to say, okay, well, it keeps you grounded, it keeps you looking at the evidence, not necessarily to say that, no, this did not happen, but let's not go too far until we actually have more evidence to be able to say, yes, this actually happened. It's like I could say maybe until about 99.9% of the way until we get 100% confirmation.
Right. Right. Well, and these things are things that they're worth detailed investigation. They're worth detailed analysis. I spent a lot of time. I spent over a decade. Actually, no, I spent about a decade um, tracking on and doing research on the whole Maya calendar 2012 issue.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll never guess where I first got interested in it. At the Burning Man Festival. I'd gone to Burning Man in 2002.
No pictures, obviously.
Yeah, I've got photos. I put some on the web. Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of fun. I'd actually been tracking on Burning Man for several years. I'd really wanted to go in 1998. I guess there was a story in Wired magazine that called it America's New Family Vacation or something like that. But I've been tracking on cyber stuff for a while, and I was interested in checking out Burning Man. So I went in 2002, and then after I came back, I read a review in the New York Times Review of Books by a book that had been written by Daniel Pinchbeck called Breaking Open the Head, a Journey into the Heart of Contemporary Shamanism. And it talked about ayahuasca, it talked about iboga, it talked about psilocybin. It discussed Pinchbeck's trip to Palenque, where he met with Terence McKenna and smoked DMT for the first time. But it was in online discussions with Daniel Pinchbeck, who had an online discussion group at the time, that I began learning things about Terence McKenna, and in particular about his own prediction of um, the oh, why am I blanking on the name of it? The well, anyway, the idea of, oh, I hate when this happens. I'm having a senior moment. What was the name of Terence's hypothesis? It was time zero. His time zero hypothesis, that there would be an eschaton that would be reached on December 21st, 2012. And anyway, people had switched to this after, remember Y2K?
Hmm.
When Y2K didn't pan out and planes didn't fall from the sky and banks didn't collapse and stuff like that, people immediately switched from Y2K to this fixation on the Maya calendar in 2012. So I started tracking on it in 2002, and then sort of as a specialist in Central American and Mexican archaeology, and also counterculture and psychedelics and these other types of things, I began tracking on it. And it was in doing that that I realized the role that Terence McKenna and that Graham Hancock and John Major Jenkins and Jose Arguelles and a variety of others had in sort of promoting that story. And I just found it really interesting. But it turned out to have no basis in reality at all. It turned out to have grown out of suggestion published in a book on the Maya in 1966. And then it was sort of batted around in the Bay Area hippie community in the 1960s, and then sort of emerged into the New Age community after the 1970s, really in 1975, when Dennis and Terence McKenna published their book, The Invisible Landscape. You may be familiar with that.
Hmm.
They later did a revised version in 1994. But anyway, there are testable things. There's this mythology that you can test. Was there really a Maya prophecy about December 21st, 2012? Did the Mayas say that the world was going to end? And did the world end in 2012? Were there sunspots? What about the Yellowstone supervolcano? Did Nibiru make an appearance? Did any of that stuff happen?
Well,
Well, people were watching, and it didn't happen, and we're still here. So
well,
you know, some
that's yeah.
that was a testable thing. It was something you could see the buildup. You could look at the hypotheses. You could say, okay, people are saying this is going to happen, and then nothing happens. Although it's not true that nothing happened. In fact, like I said, I was in Chichen Itza on December 21st, 2012. What a lot of people forgot is what happened on December 14, 2012, which really rocked everyone's world. Exactly 1 week before. You know what happened on December 14, 2012?
If I'm not mistaken, it was supposed to be a complete solar eclipse.
Nope,
No.
had nothing to eclipse. The Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre
Oh yeah.
happened exactly 1 week before December 21st, 2012. And I've wondered whether the shooter thought that the world was coming to an end and figured, I might as well kill my mother and all of these kids since everybody's going to die anyway. Again, I don't want to start a conspiracy theory. I don't want to contribute to the pain of those families at all. But the reality is that these myths and these stories can have a damaging impact. Whether that happened or not, I'm not going to say. But I think the reality is that this end of the world hypothesis also had an influence on the eschatology of ISIS, which emerges right after that. They thought that the end of the world was coming and that Armageddon was going to happen. There was going to be a great conflict between the Muslim and the Christian world that was going to transpire in the Caliphate. I think a lot of the ISIS eschatology could be related to the fact that so many people were talking about the end of the world, that if the West was preoccupied with this, then there must be something to it. But I have another thought about it as well, which is I think it was during the whole 2012 stuff that the Russians realized just how gullible Americans were and just how these stories are ones that could be accepted as real or accepted as true because people wouldn't do the background research to check it out. They were gullible. They were credulous. They would believe these things. Um, so maybe 2012 did transform things, not in ways that were expected, but in terms of bad actors taking advantage of American gullibility. How about
I,
that?
I don't necessarily think it's just like it's American gullibility. It's the perceptibility to humans on being able to be fooled. We're we are a very intelligent species. We can go to the moon and chart the cosmos billions of light years away. Yet we are dumb as rocks as a species as a whole. If it comes right down to it, we
Yeah, well,
can.
there was a guy in China who built an ark. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a global phenomenon. There were people who were paying attention to it all over the world.
Oh well, yeah, no, I was paying attention. The whole 2012 thing with Nibiru coming in, it's like maybe there is something to it. It's like, oh, is that Nibiru up in the sky? And you get your telescope, you try and find out is that spot getting bigger at nighttime? Is it is it going to be coming inbound? And no, you realize pretty quickly. It's like once it comes and goes, it's like, wow, I got taken on that one. And then they change their story. They're like, oh well, it's actually no, it's going to be like 150 years from now because they realized that once that's gone, to be able to keep the gravy train coming, that they have to push it out even further. It's like
Right,
with any doomsday prophet in history who said like, oh, it's the turn of the millennium, well, the world's going to end. People sold their stuff, and the millennium came and went, and they were still there. Satan didn't come out of the ground and didn't swallow everything up. Uh, you know, things went on. In a much more dark ages manner, but things went on.
right. Well, but here's my question for you, Chris. There was a significant chapter and part of the conclusion in Fingerprints of the Gods, written by Graham Hancock, published in 1995, that pushed this idea of the Maya calendar and of a disaster coming in 2012. Graham had a hand in promoting that mythology. Is anybody holding him accountable for having been wrong?
I can't actually answer that.
Well, it's something to think about.
Hmm, that's a good point. I'm That's actually a really good point. It's like I don't usually get much pushback from guests. This is probably one of the reasons why I do have guests with different points of view. But like, yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I've put people to task for being wrong on certain things, and I'm not going to be able to jump and say, well, he was wrong, and he should be held accountable. I don't have it in front of me to be able to read, but I know on this show, with people who were completely wrong with things, yes, I did hold them to account. And it's a matter of, yes, if there's a certain amount of credibility, but people can be wrong. People can be wrong about things, and they can be able to look back and say, hey, you know what? I was wrong about this. He had talked about Earth crust displacement, and he'd come back and said, I was wrong about that.
The pole shift, that never happened.
Pole shift, well, it's kind of happening right now to a certain extent. It is shifting, it is moving. But to like the complete
It
flip
wobbles
180.
all the time, but yes, correct. And it could happen. I mean, I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. It could happen tomorrow. These things happened in the past. We know that they happen. To be perfectly honest, we could get hit by a meteorite tomorrow. The big one could come next week. Hopefully, astronomers know what's out there and can give us a heads up on it. But we still get these news reports about something that passed within 100 million miles or whatever, and nobody knew about it until it was already a near miss. We're not tracking on those things as much as we can. But at the same time, I think that there's also a certain amount of what's the best way to a certain amount of narcissism and arrogance in thinking that something like that will happen in our lifetime, when in fact thousands of lifetimes have gone by in which it didn't happen, and there probably will be thousands of lifetimes more in which it won't happen. Fixating on the idea that it will happen in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, those are still incredibly small probabilities in the grand sweep of human experience. The Chicxulub impact in the Yucatan, the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, well, that was 65 million years ago. That was back when our ancestors were just little shrew-like creatures climbing in the trees. Um, you know, if these things happen only every 65 million years, there's not a very good chance that we're actually going to see it, or our children will see it, or our grandchildren, or great grandchildren, or great great grandchildren even. The probability of it happening in the next few hundred years is actually pretty small.
Well, you look at Heaven's Gate, which is an example I've used on the show a bunch of times, where they were sure. I think it was it Comet Enki?
It was Hale-Bopp.
Hale-Bopp. Thank you. Where they thought Hale-Bopp was, well, they thought it was a spaceship. Maybe it is a spaceship. Maybe it's just a ball of ice and rock flying through space. And a lot of people, except for like one guy who still manages the website, killed themselves to join the spaceship. How many daughters and sons committed suicide thinking that the world was going to end, but they had this chance to be able to escape?
Yeah,
That's there's a lot of destructiveness that can come with being a part of a thought cult or a cult in general. That's why you need to be able to have a certain amount of sense about you to be able to read the background information and not to be able to take everything that is being said as gospel. Even with Graham's ideas, I find his ideas to be very thought provoking. Do I think that it's a possibility? Heck yeah. Do I take everything he says, at gospel? No, I don't take anything except for my mom. There's nobody that I except my mom and my wife. I love you, honey. I do. That I take their word as gospel because again, it comes down to everyone always has motive about something, and people can be wrong. Humans are fallible. The whole point and the gift that was given to us in life and in reason is to be able to look at information, research it, and then research the possibility behind it. If we as people take everything at face value, then we no longer have freedom of choice. We no longer have free will. We're just following along with everyone else who's presenting things to us.
right. Well, that's very true, and people are wrong, and you can't trust everyone. But if you're having problems with your new Tesla, okay, are you going to go and ask a Tesla engineer or a certified Tesla mechanic, or are you going to ask the person who checks your groceries at the grocery store?
Well, it depends. Does
You
the
know,
guy who is the guy who is in the grocery store? Does he run hackmytesla.com and has he basically figured out how to repair the Teslas himself? Because after 3 years, they don't repair those things, or I think it's 5 years, they don't repair them anymore, or you have to spend a lot of money to be able to do it. And so people had to figure it out themselves, and it's you have to have a certain amount of experience or at least a mind for these things to be able to do that. So can the Tesla operator fix it, and can the guy who has fixed his own Tesla a bunch of times can they fix it? Yes. The guy who works at the Tesla shop and is certified, there may be a warranty with those parts and labor. The guy who's doing it out of the back of his truck or doing it in his parking lot, he may not have a warranty. If he screws up, then that work is not guaranteed. So that's kind of the main thing. It may work, but it may not. Even with the Tesla guy, it may work, and it may break. He may screw up, but at least you can go back and say, "Hey, yeah, that thing you fixed, yeah, it doesn't work anymore. There's your warranty for 3 months of labor and repair and parts. Fix it for me."
right. Well, and the guy who checks out your groceries could very well have been practicing in his garage to give you a really excellent root canal. But my guess is that you probably feel more comfortable having a dentist do it.
Well, the dentists have the best drugs, so yes.
But my point is, why not go to the nerds who have been studying archaeology since they were kids, who've been reading mountains of literature? See my mountains of literature? Who've been reading mountains of literature for their entire careers, not of trade books, not of magazines, not of YouTube videos, but actual vetted, peer-reviewed, academically published, responsible material.
Mhm.
Why not talk to us instead of the person who is, traveling around the world doing a few interviews and writing a trade book? It's the nerds who have the answers, and archaeologists are nerds. We are. We're not an orthodoxy that is out to control the world. We're not a cabal that is seeking to shutter the doors of knowledge. we're nerds who like sharing information that we are into because we're nerdy. Um, it you know the characterization of archaeologists as some sort of closed-minded, orthodox, uh, uh, scientific lockbox, it just doesn't correspond to my reality at all. It really doesn't. The archaeologists I know are people who travel a lot. They're people who read a lot. Many of them smoke cannabis and do psychedelics. Many of them read fantasy and science fiction. Many of them do all of these kinds of things that I think many of your listeners probably do as well. We're just regular folks who happen to be nerding out on archaeology. So
Most of my audience is nerds. We watch Star Wars,
yeah.
Monty Python.
So,
It's kind of our
but
thing.
why demonize us by calling us orthodox archaeology, which is something that does not even exist? What's the point of that?
Well, there isn't a point, and that's kind of my point. I don't look at archaeology as as an orthodoxy. It's you have yes, you can always have in every single group, and again, I have to do the both sides thing. You can have people whom will get dogmatic. At the end of the day, you have people whom are looking for knowledge and they're looking at knowledge in one perspective or another. The idea is to not become dogmatic, and even people from the truth-seeking movement can be incredibly dogmatic themselves, and they can't necessarily see the other point of view or even approach the other point of view. And it's the same thing with our academia. There may not be necessarily be an open mind for some people to be able to see the other point of view. And I think it's a matter of perspective to say, well, if why do that? What is the point of that? So demonizing somebody whom has a study and who spent their entire lives doing it, no, I don't believe that is uh, you know, I don't believe that that's a good thing to say. I'm an expert in advertising. I have a degree in advertising. If somebody said, "Well, you're just an advertising guy. You don't know anything," man, I've been on social media since I was 5 years old. I'm on the streets. I know the real thing. Well, yeah, to a certain extent. Do you know why X, Y, Z happens? There's a certain methodology behind it. So the
But
idea,
I could make a commercial.
could it
Who's
sell?
saying
That's the
my
question.
commercial wouldn't be better than yours? You have
Exactly.
a marketing degree, but I could come up with a good slogan. I could come up with something that would sell whatever you want to sell. So why is the marketing guy so much better than me?
Because there's a certain methodology behind it. And that's exactly the point of view that you're being able to say, and I can understand that perspective.
Yeah, well, it's the same type of thing. Those of us who do archaeology have a methodology. We have
Mhm.
ways of vetting and checking and testing again and being skeptical and reading something more and looking at what the history of the ideas was, looking at the individuals and are they credible. We do enormous amounts of evaluation, which is part of our methodology. Um, and I think all professional archaeologists do that. Part of the reality, as I mentioned earlier in your show, is that there's a very tiny percentage of archaeologists who are also interested in alternative history or pseudoarchaeology or fringe archaeology, whatever you want to call it. There's a relatively small group of us who track on the discourse about ayahuasca or shamanism or UFOs or Atlantis or other types of things. There are some good nerds out there who can talk about both of those things, who know about the occult and esoterica as well as knowing about sort of the latest on paleo migrations into the new world. Um, it's hard to keep track on everything, but why not go talk to the people who are nerding out on that? Why not seek their opinions?
That's what I think I've been doing. I mean,
I think so too.
I'm
And I'm not talking to you, Chris, because I know that you do that, and I know that many of your listeners do that. But I think that you're right. There are a lot of people who just are kind of closed-minded, and they're not interested in that. I don't want to talk to an academic. I don't want to talk to an archaeologist. They're closed-minded. They already have made up their minds. They're not going to consider the questions I want to ask. Well, that's bullshit. Pardon my French. It's just not true. Archaeologists, those of us who have some patience, are interested in knowing why people want to believe what they believe. That's one of the things I, as an anthropologist, in addition to being an archaeologist, have a very sincere interest in. why do people believe weird things? Um, and I think it's my colleague David Anderson who calls it weird shitology. We're weird shitologists.
I love it. Weird shitology. I'm going to use that one. Tell him I'll help spread that term. So
But it lives in graphic novels. It lives in adventure stories. It used to live in pulp fiction. There's a long history to this stuff, and um, it's going to be with us for a really long time. In fact, it may actually be one. And here's one of my main interests, Chris. It may actually be the foundation for future religions. Now, Deadeism is already a thing. There are potential religious movements that could migrate out of these belief systems, especially if you're combining charismatic personalities and psychedelic substances. You may very well get into a situation where you get true believers who have seen the light, and become zealots for promoting a particular worldview, that has about as much credibility as the Bible, or as much credibility,
Republicans.
or or or
I'm
or,
sorry.
or Lord of the or Lord of the Rings. There may very well be a Tolkien-based religion. Why not? Or Thrones, or Harry Potter, or you name it. Pick your preferred mythos.
There was a Tolkien. There was actually a Tolkien cult back in the 70s and 60s. So it's happened.
Yeah, it does happen, and stuff happens. Like one of my favorite authors of all time, he was an atheist, he was a skeptic, he had a tremendous sense of humor, he was a brilliant writer, he was a racist also, so he had his downside. H.P. Lovecraft.
Uh-huh.
Most H.P. Lovecraft's fiction was written as parody of theosophists and alternative historians and cultists and others. He was actually making fun of that stuff by writing it into his fiction. And then what happens is it comes into the gaming community, and the whole Cthulhu mythos takes on a life of its own, and people think that what he was writing about was real, when in fact what he was writing about was a parody of what he thought other people thought was real.
They're actually going to make a shared universe off of H.P. Lovecraft's work, and I think they're doing it seriously.
Yeah, well,
So
his stuff is coming back in. I mean, when I was a nerd back in high school, I didn't know anybody else who knew who H.P. Lovecraft was, much read his stuff. I think I was drawn to it because it was just so weird and esoteric and strange. But now everybody seems to know, and I think Color Out of Space is being made into a film, or I don't know if it's already been released or not.
I don't think so.
But all of that stuff is, what used to be weird, esoteric stuff that I was drawn to mostly because nobody else was. All of a sudden, it's like mainstream. What happened with that?
Nerds took over the world.
I have to look harder for stuff that's truly weird and esoteric now, because the stuff that I used to think was weird and esoteric, you can get at a couple mouse clicks.
Oh, spend half an hour on Tumblr. Trust me, you'll find something. I know that we're getting close to about the hour and a half mark, and I know that it's late where you are, and we've kept you a little bit longer than we had scheduled. I do apologize for starting late.
Not a problem.
But I want to make sure at least that we leave some tidbits for hopefully if you want to come back on here and talk some shop, because I had a really good time. And I have to say, as Bernie, thank you very much for introducing me to this man. I've had a blast talking to him, and I hope you all had a good time listening to him as well. Dr. Hopes, how can people get a hold of you? Again, you've got your Twitter account. I'll make sure we've got the website in the bio. So, do you have an email address or website?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. People can write to me at hoopes@ku.edu, which is my email address. I have been online in one form or another since 1985. I started doing social media back when it was called FidoNet, and Usenet, and list servers. I joined Facebook in, I think it was 2005, which was a year after it got started. I have a pretty big online footprint, so I'm not difficult to find.
Fantastic. One more thing before we go is I'm going to see if the outro music plays. That's kind of it's one of our one of our, I'm gonna say, like, it's our thing, because the outro music sometimes will play and sometimes will not. So, oh, there we go. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you're catching us on Facebook, you can go to the YouTube channel and watch us from the beginning. For whatever reason, my Facebook page didn't actually start transmitting. It is also available on the Den of Lore Facebook page, so you can go see that from the start as well. My name's Chris George Zuger. This has been another episode of the Den of Lore, and yeah, thanks for all joining us on today. Hopefully I can start doing these a little more often. Today was not as busy as I'd expected, but still pretty busy. And if, again, I need a producer, if anybody wants to be my producer, you know how to get a hold of me. Andre, maybe you. We'll see. Good night, folks. Have yourself a good time.